And it's my great pleasure to welcome onto the set yet again the former Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Howard. Always good to speak with you.
Happy to be with you.
Look, we're in the thrust, this rush to the polling day, just a week and a half away. Let me start with the issue of the day, and that is wages and wage rises. This is something you dealt with so often over your career. An inflation rate of 5.1%. Does that mean that ipso facto, according to Anthony Albanese, those on the lowest wage, on the minimum wage, should get a 5.1% pay rise at least?
No, I don't know what economics degree he got to lead him to say that. And in the end, the only really effective wage rises are those that have got some productivity element in it. Now, we all like to see our wages going up. That's human nature. And I understand that there are cost of living pressures, although they've always been there. There've always been cost of living pressures. But you've got to make sure that wage rises are affordable, and you also got to make sure that wage rises that can be afforded by some companies and some firms aren't imposed on small businesses that can't afford them. Now, the whole across-the-board approach that the Labor Party is so fond of isn't really the right approach.
Is that the risk here, damage to the economy? I know that the man who would be an assistant treasurer if Labor wins this election, Andrew Leigh, who's an economics professor, has written papers in the past saying that when you increase the minimum wage too much, you actually create unemployment.
Well, he's right. I mean, a very successful Labor leader I once knew, I still know him, Tony Blair, famously said, fairness in the workplace starts with a chance of a job. Now, right at the moment, chances of getting a job are better, much better than they've been for a very long time. And I think that's something that people should keep in mind when they vote on Saturday week. If fundamentally you are interested in fairness, and the Labor Party says it's interested in fairness, well, the most important element of fairness in the workplace is keeping unemployment low. And this government is now talking about having an unemployment rate that'll be the lowest in 50 years. Now, that's a pretty impressive performance.
Is Anthony Albanese the most economically illiterate candidate you've seen running for the Prime Ministership in your time?
Well, look, I'm not in the business of casting generalised aspersions, but he does give the impression of somebody who's not across the detail. Now, I think of how policy meagre his offerings are. I mean, there's virtually nothing there, and he can't get it right. I mean, if I may say so, I remember going through an election campaign as Prime Minister where I had to be across the detail of the biggest tax change in Australia since Federation, the GST and the associated things. And Peter Costello and I had to go through that campaign and answer legitimately cross-examination from all sorts of journalists. Many of them were and obviously trying to call us short.
That was a big idea taken to an election campaign.
Well, of course it was a big idea.
A big and difficult idea taken to an election campaign. What is the big idea at the centre of this election campaign?
Well, I think the big idea is to continue the remarkable recovery that this country has experienced coming out of the pandemic. We mustn't forget that according to every metric, we have done so well. Our death rate per million much lower. Our economy, according to the IMF, is growing more rapidly. We're returning to employment levels that are lower than what unemployment levels rather lower than what they were before we went into it. So I think the big idea is to keep that going.
But isn't that the problem for the coalition and for Scott Morrison? The central message is stick with us to finish this recovery. There are no big contested policy ideas. So the campaign has become a rabble of debates about minor grievances.
But I don't think it's a failure to say to the Australian people, wrong, look, we think you should re-elect us because we have done a very competent job handling the pandemic. We always do a competent job on national security. And the other crowd don't have the runs on the board in economic management or national security, so stay with us. Now, that may, to some people, be unexciting, but it's the bread and butter of our future.
I've got to say, in my quieter moments when I think about what a Labor government might be, there's all sorts of things you might think about. You think about the economy, you think about national security. But in my heart of hearts, the worst thing I'd want to see in this country again is that trauma and tragedy and expense and heartache on border protection. It's happened twice. You've had to deal with it, and then Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison had to deal with it. But people don't see the risk. They think that problem is fixed, as they thought in 2007.
Well, I don't think that problem is ever fixed. And unfortunately for the Labor Party, it's got form. And Kevin Rudd in 2007 said, no problem, I'll stick to it. He didn't. And that represented the greatest single public policy failure of his short term in government. And every so often when the pressure's on, Anthony Albanese doesn't really understand what's involved in border protection. I mean, he illustrated that with his clumsy answer on temporary protection visas. I mean, he doesn't understand what they are because he doesn't understand the policy. I mean, he doesn't have a lot to get across, and yet he keeps stumbling on the detail. Now, that has got to say something about whether or not he's up to the job.
Was it a mistake for the coalition to sign up to net zero by 2050? Has that removed a key area of differentiation on climate and energy policy?
I don't believe that the government has made a mistake on that front. I mean, you've got to take into account not only the scientific arguments, but also the expectations of the public about what can be achieved. No, I don't think it was.
Well, was it a mistake then to not at least embrace the prospect of a domestic nuclear power industry? Because in the end, if the world's going to get to net zero, nuclear electricity is going to play a much bigger role, isn't it? So it's probably a necessity.
Well, I've had some comments to make because I think nuclear power will come. But in relation to the AUKUS agreement, the nuclear subs, the government has made it clear that you don't need a domestic nuclear industry immediately in order to consummate that deal. And that's a point that the Prime Minister made, and a point, incidentally, the Leader of the Opposition agreed with. But from my point of view, and I've made this known for quite a long time, way back to when I was Prime Minister, that I think public opinion is shifting on nuclear power, and I think it is something that will come. But it's not an issue in this election campaign.
It's not an issue in this election campaign. It could have been if the government had, say, undertaken to get rid of the legislative barriers to a domestic nuclear
Well, you won't
industry.
get rid of those legislative barriers except with bipartisan support.
Right.
Because they were put there by my government for the very good reason we wanted to preserve the nuclear medicine industry at Lucas Heights in Sydney. The Labor Party opposed our legislation on that, and we had to seek the support, believe it or not, of the Greens in order to get that very important facility, which was significant for life and limb for many people, for health, preserved.
Absolutely. I went up and had a look at that last year. It's a fantastic facility. I'll get back I'll get onto the national security side of it again, and I know you don't want this debate now, but when you talk about a domestic nuclear energy, and it's not controversial, they're building new reactors in the UK, they're expanding.
Oh, the change that's occurring in Europe is extraordinary.
To me, it speaks to the climate debate. If you want emissions-free energy that is reliable and affordable and maintain your energy security, nuclear has to be the answer, doesn't it?
Well, it's certainly got to be part of a discussion, and I've never disguised this. I've argued it for quite a long time. And I commissioned, when I was Prime Minister all those years ago, the Ziggy Swatowski to actually lay out a blueprint. And he said what would need to be done, and we do have 38% of the world's easily recoverable uranium reserves. So,
and the Labor Premier in South Australia went down that path.
Yeah, he did. And once again, we are reminded that Providence gave this country these wonderful reserves, not just coal and iron ore, but also uranium. And it is negligent of this nation to ignore the value of what Providence gave us.
Indeed. Now, the reason you spoke about nuclear energy is because of the AUKUS deal, which involves nuclear power submarines for Australia, and the flow on from that saying that we'll get more nuclear technology and expertise, and this will surely help develop a domestic nuclear power industry. On the security side, though, you must think that AUKUS deal is one of the most significant arrangements in many, many decades when it comes to our national security.
I thought it was a terrific deal. I always had personal reservations about the original deal with the French. Much and all, I admire France as a nation, the French as a people. I had some real reservations. I didn't express them at the time because it wasn't my place, but I was delighted because we have an arrangement with our two most natural national security allies. It's an arrangement I think that will give a great sense of comfort to many of our neighbours in the region. I mean, they haven't said so, but I think it makes so much sense. And obviously the government has got a deal, as it said it will, with the period between now and the arrival of the first nuclear subs. But I have no doubt, given the history of the defence cooperation between the three countries involved, I have no doubt that the best arrangement to cover the gap will be worked out.
Now, UK, US, Australia working on this project and other high technology projects. Obviously, it's aimed at countering the influence of China in this region. How concerned are you about the deal struck between Solomon Islands and China? And do you believe that Prime Minister Sogavare has sold his own nation down the tube in favour of perhaps his own interests?
Well, ultimately that will only be revealed by time. Of course I'm unhappy with the arrangement. You'd have to be. And of course I suspect the motives of the Chinese. Mr. Sogavare has got quite a track record of being a touch anti-Australian. I had some dealings with him and some of his rivals when I was in office, and so I know his mindset and I know his attitude. On the other hand, you have to play a patient game, and Australia being, in the context of our Pacific region, a large power, we have to respect the independence country. They don't want to be treated as vassal states, although they run the risk once they sign on the dotted line with the Chinese of that happening. And I think it's a very delicate challenge, and I think, if I may say so ever so quietly, it does need the hand of people who are experienced in national security matters.
Indeed, well said. It's a worrying situation. Under your Prime Ministership, of course, Australian soldiers and police officers put themselves at risk to restore order.
Well, we did, and it was, can I tell you, it was widely welcomed. I remember visiting the Solomon Islands just after the Ramsey intervention, and gee, they were so happy. But it helped at every level. It's not just troops and police, but we gave them public service infrastructure, and the elements, better elements of a stronger civil society.
Now, let's get back to the election campaign. These fake independents, I call them, these so-called voice of independents, are trying to capitalise.
I call them anti-liberal groupies because none of them is standing against...
Was that a sexist term? People said it was sexist.
Really?
Groupie.
I mean...
They are anti-liberal, absolutely, right?
Well, why aren't they standing against Mr Albanese? Why aren't they standing in Maribyrnong in Victoria against Bill Shorten? Why aren't they standing against Tanya Plibersek in Sydney? They're all safe Labor seats. Their goal is to destroy the Liberal government. And if any of them gets elected, that will greatly diminish our prospects of winning.
Now, as a Liberal Party elder statesman, every seat is sacred, of course, but what damage would they do to the Liberal Party and to the nation if they're able to take out Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer?
Do enormous damage. I mean, Josh is an outstanding Treasurer. He's an indefatigable worker, and he's a great Liberal. And I admire him enormously, and he's done a terrific job in managing the Australian economy, and he'd been an enormous loss. But, I mean, I also agree with every seat. I don't ever like seeing Liberals defeated.
I've got to ask you, Mr Howard, you've been out campaigning in this election. You've been interstate on the ground in marginal electorates. It's hard work. You don't need to do it. Why are you doing that? You're helping people win their seats. You're really working hard. I've got to say, in contrast to the performance of some other former Liberal Prime Ministers.
Well, I'm not going to talk about them. I'm doing it because I think Australia needs the retention of the Morrison government. I think it's been a good government, made mistakes, and as my government is, all governments do. But I think Australia will be stronger, better and more prosperous with the Liberal government. And I owe the Liberal Party a lot. I would never have achieved what I hope was able to achieve in certain areas in public life without the benediction, if I can put it that way, of the Liberal Party. And I owe it. And the least I can do at a time like this is to get out and do my bit.
Well, I think it's impressive. I know our viewers see it and they think it's impressive. It's obvious you do it because you believe that the party deserves it, but they're very, very lucky to have you out there because I can see you're still very popular on the campaign trail. I want to ask you about a new project. Now, we didn't ask you on to talk about this. I hope you don't mind, but you've presenting and hosting a documentary for Foxtel. It goes to air next week, looking at Robert Menzies' home movies. Tell us about what you've found and what we're going to...
Well, it is a terrific little enterprise because Bob Menzies, way back in the dark days of World War II, when he went to London to press on Churchill and the British War Cabinet the vulnerability of Australia to a Japanese attack, he took a motion home movie, colour, in 1940, and some of these wonderful...
We're seeing some of it on screen now, extraordinary historic footage.
And his wonderful examples of Churchill feeding the ducks and having a picnic with the royal family, and how it took 23 days or something to fly by flying boat from Rose Bay in Sydney, this tortuous route. It's a great experience, and they're on is holding up the camera, and it's a piece of wonderful Australian history.
Wonderful. We'll look forward to seeing that. John Howard, the reporter presenter on the Menzies movies. Just before I let you go, who will win the election?
I think it's very tight. I do. I think the coalition will make it, but I'm not complacent, and I know the Prime Minister's not complacent. This is a tight election. It's a democracy. Whoever wins, well, they're entitled to the support of the Australian people. You won't see any people complaining about crookery in this country because we have a clean electoral system.
Indeed, and a great electoral commission. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Howard. I appreciate it. That is John Howard, former Prime Minister of Australia, and that documentary, the Menzies movies, is going to be on Foxtel Wednesday, May the 18th, 7:30 p.m. next week, and you'll be able to see it on Foxtel on demand. Don't you worry about that.